So back again with this series of videos no one's interested in, with no subscribers. I do it for the benefit of mankind, of the whole mankind, because the bands I'll talk about have not been discussed on this medium on YouTube, so someone has to do it, and I'll do it. I'm not doing it for any other reason aside from that. So now today I'm talking about I'm talking again about a 90s music niche, a 90s kind of genre, a genre that has one of the dumbest and most stupid definitions any genre ever had. I'm talking about slo-core, that has even been labeled sadcore. Sadcore is the stupidest label I've ever heard, but apparently it kinda describes this music pretty well in a certain sense, but it's stupid anyway. So slowcore, if you want, slowcore probably was born in the very late 80s, and there were a few bands that are considered responsible for its kind of creation, but I think the most emblematic, the most representative and the most iconic band of this particular genre of music was Codeine, the band I'm talking about today, and especially their album Frigid starts, one of the absolute masterpieces of the 90s and of all time. One of the very last records that sounded like nothing else before them. That is a thing that is almost impossible to do now, apparently. Codeine were among the very last bands that managed to do that. So Codeine formed, I think, in 1990 or shortly before that. They were a band from Chicago, I think, but they were a band from New York, but they recorded in Chicago or something like that. But they were also under the label Sub Pop of Seattle, that was going pretty strong in those years. Codeine were born in the hardcore post-punk environment, probably, but they had a sound that had very little to do with hardcore punk, almost nothing. They weren't the only band that played a particular kind of music that was labeled slowcore, because there is a pretty big list of bands like, for example, Galaxy 500, Low, Red House Painters, but yeah. Galaxy 500 probably were never really slowcore. They were something else, something more abstract, more psychedelic, more intellectual, probably. Maybe someday I'm going to talk about them. Codeine were not really doing what Galaxy or Low or Red House were doing. They were principally, their principal inspiration and their principal ground were probably Slint from Louisville, Kentucky, probably another slowcore band that has also been labeled in many ways, like post-rock, post-hardcore, Slint-core, but yeah, Slint, what Slint did was deconstruct the rock song, deconstruct the abused structures of rock music, using hardcore punk violence and explosions and very smart lyrics, and create this weird hybrid that sounded pretty alien when it came out. And that almost alone created a post-hardcore subgenre. So Codeine is it's kind of similar to Slint. Probably Slint are the most similar band to Codeine because they. I didn't tell what was the sound of Codeine. So Codeine and the whole slo-core sound was the songs from Codeine and from slo-core bands were mostly, as you can guess, very slow tempos, very dark atmospheres, all this very dismissed feeling, but these arpeggiating guitars, but with kind of unexpected explosions, deflagrations, with the loudest noise, and a voice that is constantly on the edge of REM's lip. There is always kind of I didn't want to use this word, but apparently it had to came out. Kind of depressing voice, very dark, very low energy stuff, and this creates this whole vibe, this whole feeling of intense alienation, intense spleen, sort of desperate meditation on becoming adult, growing old, being alone in a competitive world, all this stuff that kind of started bubbling up in the surface of pop culture in the early 90s due to neoliberalist policies that the governments had started to adopt in the 80s, and this day we are totally immersed in that. We are totally helpless, hopelessly alone in this world of man versus man. So what slo-core was and what it represented, in a way, was the logical consequence of punk, was its natural next step. It's what was left when punk realized it had lost its war, let's say, if there ever was a war, but please follow me on that. It folded back on itself, kind of imploding. In the 90s, in the early 90s, late 80s, most of the old schoolers of punk had died of overdose or got mad, went in prison, or had just given up and went for a regular job and stuff. So those who were left, they only found a way to vent their anger and their sadness and their frustration and alienation in lavishing these feelings on themselves. In a delicate blow of candid existential pain. So it was the implosion of punk. When musicians realized they really had no one to point their finger at, they went through the 80s with that Reagan stuff. It was Ronald Reagan stuff, fuck Reagan, fuck Republicans, fuck you, fuck everybody, I'm mad, you suck, police sucks. So it was always the me against you, always the us against them mentality. Then when they became adults, they realized there really wasn't any enemy outside of them. So it was this kind of reversing of perspective. So they started musically becoming more introverted, more depressed, more dismissed. Their energy started draining out. And also, it's not casual that shoegaze was going strong in the same years. Loveless from My Bloody Valentine has this sort of spleen, abandonment, this illusion, this low energy contemplation. It was just the vibe of the time, probably. But slowcore is one of those genres that Codeine was one of those bands that apparently came out of nowhere. So they are very highly regarded among critics because they are one of those very few bands that sound like no one else. You really can't tell what they were up to when they came out with these sounds. It's really, when you have a band, you try to convey all your musical inspiration in something, but you cannot really think. It's not a rational thinking, doing. I want to create a sound no one else has ever done. It's all very very random. You play the music you like, you add your own contribution, and very few times it happens in history that a band comes out with an amazing new sound. You cannot really understand where it came from. I mean, Colin, if you think about it, slowcore was a totally rational evolution of punk. I mean, if I was there in the early 90s, the age I am now, I would have thought, fuck, I could have done that. It was in the air, this slow evolution, this kind of sound. But Codeine were the first band that did that. So they had this Frigid Stars album that was totally revolutionary when it came out. Then they released an EP and then another album, The White Birch, and then they disbanded. Having run out of ideas. Stephen Immerward, the bassist and frontman, started a career in research science, I don't know, medical science, I'm not sure. But this album is a milestone of the 90s. Check it out, it sounds like nothing else. Slowcore is not really a genre. Slowcore is mostly the sound of Codeine, but there were other bands that played really cool, similar vibe of music. Check it out, Codeine, Frigid Stars.